Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to ask Randy Grow to lead us in prayer. Let us all bow. Amen. Before I start into the lesson, found this nice silver tie tack, or tie clasp, right down here Sunday morning. So it belongs to anybody here, or you know it might belong to. I'm guessing maybe somebody who helped serve the Lord's Supper Sunday. But anyway, I will have that. I'll try to remember to announce it again at some point because it is nice, and you may see me wearing it if nobody ever claims it. So hold it in place there. All right, last week we did lesson number 2 on stolen arrows. The psalmist says our man's children are like a quiver of arrows, and they're a blessing. And unfortunately, they're being stolen. So we're going to finish that up real quick. And then Brother John, who's not here to keep an eye on what I say tonight, brought up a subject that we're going to spend the rest of our time on, and maybe some time next week as well, would be the plan. We talked about the challenge of stolen arrows. We're talking about challenges to the Christian home and Christian family. And we're talking about these three things. We talked first about the powerful influence that the world has on our families, especially our children, the inadequate impact of the home sometimes, and how that can make a difference. And then we were ready to talk about the wrong impression of the church. This is a very short third point. I anticipate maybe in the future making this longer and bringing this out, but for now I wanted to include it here as we talk about it. The wrong impression of the church. And here's the thing. Our young people are unlikely to have a more favorable view of the Lord's church than we do. I have observed for a number of years lots of young people and lots of parents. And the parents had a variety of approaches toward the church based on their behavior and involvement. Sometimes it was a deep love for the church. Other times it would appear to be rather casual and nonchalant. And I think I've said this before. I've only seen one case in all the years where a child grew up and actually loved the church more than his parents did. They were just sort of lukewarm and, here and there, and not really involved in many ways. And now that young man is a deacon for missions at a congregation that I'm aware of. So it's true. Our young people are not likely to care more about the church than mom and dad do. And so that is why I put this up here as one of the things that can cause our children to be stolen. And the things that we'll talk about tonight in response to Brother John's question last week, I think will bring some of that up. Here's just some of the things that I suggested and wrote down as we talk about our children and loving the church. And it goes back to that communication, spending time with them we've already talked about, but communicating with them about the various aspects of the church. For instance, how do you handle conflict, both in the church and the family? We're all humans, people, and there will be conflict sometimes. How do you handle that? Talk about that with our children. And don't let them think bad things about the Lord's church just because there is sometimes some conflict. Well, there is in the home. That doesn't make it a terrible home. Talk about criticism. What kind of remarks can be made in a positive way and what shouldn't be made at all. And what do our children hear? What do their ears hear as far as the things that we say about the people that we worship with and the people that we do other things with? Talk about serving and involvement with them. If we want them to serve and be involved as they grow up and make their own decisions. Talk about the best place to find your peers, your friends. And there's no better place than the Lord's body for those. Talk about the sermon, what they heard, what they see in that. It's just as young as they can start understanding and making comments about it and picking out words and pick out things that you like for them to look for, listen for, and think about, and then talk about it. And, of course, priorities and how church impacts that. Because, again, they're probably going to view the church about the same as parents do, and perhaps a little less. Then I had 5, from reading a whole lot of things, I had 5 ideas here that I'm going to share with you now. Just a little bit of overlap, probably, when we get into this other lesson. Number 1, don't turn their spiritual training over to preachers, teachers, lads, leaders, mentors, youth ministers, or anyone else. Don't turn their spiritual training over to the rest of the church or to anybody. The spiritual training comes in the home with dad leading and mom modeling as well what Christian husbands and wives and mothers and fathers are. Number 2, share your humanity with them, your mistakes and your struggles, etc. Be concerned about their struggles. Listen and answer their questions and help them see that serving the Lord is so much more, and in fact is not well defined if all we're thinking about is rules and checking attendance. Those are just some of the things. Now, as I say, we'll get more into those as we get into tonight's lesson, because we're quickly going to change to this question. The challenge of the wrong sacrifice. If you were here last week, you heard Brother John Ferguson make this statement, and it struck me, and I thought about it all week and prepared for it for tonight. And Brother John does a great deal of counseling with families, among other things. And he's a professional. He's not just a preacher who helps people. He's a professional. And as we talked about sacrificing for the Lord's church, sacrificing for Christ, he made the point that in his work with people, he sometimes sees this, that the child in the family sees themselves as the sacrifice. They don't see everybody sacrificing together to serve the Lord. They see themselves as the one who is missing out, the one who is perhaps mistreated. I wish I had John here to say it again in his words, but I believe that's the gist of it. If any of you have any additions for that, hold up your hand and share that. And I thought about that, and I want to talk about it tonight, but I want to preface it with this statement. We're not talking about anybody in particular tonight. I'd rather we didn't get in, we're not going to get any specific situations, because Brother John is faced with the thing that we're all faced with, and it's when you're trying to help somebody especially when you're trying to counsel and bring two or more people together, you, the counselor, or you, the helper, the servant to people, you will never know all the facts. And so when a young man tells him, you know, Mom and Dad made me the sacrifice when it comes to church, well, we're probably not really prepared on that individual case to say, well, I know what they did wrong, or I know that what they did right and you're wrong. You know, I don't think we can do that. I know we can't do that, because in counseling, one of the things that's very fundamental is that the people who come to you don't always give you the real problems that are going on at first. And sometimes you may never get around to the real heart of the matter, because you can only know what people reveal to you. So counseling is a very challenging thing. But I want us to talk about some things here that have to do with making sure that our young people do not feel like they're the sacrifice. I think that's where we can be blessed. That's where we can make some advances. If we'll just simply acknowledge, now, if we do this, yes, that's going to cause our young person to pull away from the family and the church probably. But if we'll do this, it will draw him closer to us as a family and closer to the Lord's church in the process. So that's what I want us to think about tonight in particular. We're all familiar with this scripture. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I found this, just happened to run across this nice little graphic this past week as I was reading about this. Here are the places where this same thought appears. Of course, that's from Ephesians 6 in verse 4. Provoke is the word in the New King James. Colossians 3:21, Paul is saying something very similar. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Some of you may have a translation that has exasperated up there instead of wrath, and that's acceptable as far as a translation from what I've read. The interesting thing is that provoke in Ephesians 6:4 and provoke in Colossians 3:21 come from different Greek words, but they basically get to the same point. The word used for provoke there in Ephesians chapter 6 suggests, first of all, to make angry, and then as a kind of a subword, to exasperate. The second word, which is not a distant relative of it, I mean it's similar to it, but it's a different word, means to stir up anger to the point of exasperation, to bring about resentment, to make someone resentful. So it's basically the same thing. Because of the way that something is handled, the treatment that's given, a child gets angry in a way that should not ever happen. We all know, we all understand that children are going to get angry, right? Children get angry with the truth. If we speak the truth in love, there's still going to be some anger there. But there's a difference between teaching the truth in love and the things that we're going to talk about tonight that are not good. Vines in Vines Expository Dictionary, as he talks about this, the first word for provoke there in Ephesians 6 and verse 4, he said anger was, and this word for anger, was considered the strongest of all the passions by the Greeks back in those days. That's how they used that word. The strongest passion of all was anger. And I would like for us to think about that and appreciate that, because that is that's very telling. Why did Paul, through inspiration, tell us not to get our children to this point? Because it's a powerful passion, and it leads someone out of control. I think you can probably read this. If I turn around, I can read it. And it certainly doesn't look like it did on my screen, but that's okay. In the 5 love languages of children, these two guys wrote that book a few years ago. Gary Chapman's the same guy, I think, that wrote the 5 love languages of words. I think got a series of books sort of like that. This is about children. They say the primary lifetime threat to your child is his or her own anger. If your child does not handle his own anger well, it will damage or destroy him. The mishandling of anger is related to every present and future problem your child may have, from poor grades to damaged relationships to possible suicide. It is imperative that you do all you can do to safeguard your child now and in the future. We want our children to be able to deal with anger. We do not want them to have anger created because in our relationship with them as parents, we exasperate them. That we push them to the point by some kind of behavior that their reaction to anger is not in a godly way, because it is so powerful. And it's associated very much with self-control. And we can just imagine all the problems that can cause. So let's look at some ways that children can be provoked to anger, brought to the point of angry exasperation. And then, of course, we can talk about some of the other way to avoid that as well. One thing that's been suggested, and I read about 20 different, lists and articles about this, and this is the best collection that I found here. Lack of marital harmony is something that at some point can lead a child to an exasperated type of anger. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. If that does not happen between husbands and wives, as the children come about and grow older, then they're going to be affected by that. They're going to observe that if we're taking them to Bible classes and we're taking them to hear the preacher, and he's talking about this oneness, they learn about marriage and all in their class, and they don't see that at home. They might make different observations of it, but they're going to observe it. Hebrews 12 and verse 15. The Hebrew writer said, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. The point I point out there is the root of bitterness springing up because of trouble. That is what can happen to a child or to children when there is a lack of marital harmony, and mom and dad are not modeling the relationship that a young person has been taught, perhaps throughout most of his life, in Bible class and other spiritual settings. He sees something, it's different. It's not there. And that can certainly be an exasperation to the child, as well as not providing a model for them when it comes time for them to be a husband or a wife. So that is one thing that can cause exasperation. I'm going to do about 4 or 5 and then stop and see about comments here. So I'm going to try to remember to do that. Number 2, a child-centered home. Now, don't hold your hand up, but how many people, before I put this up as a problem, how many of you would have thought, a child-centered home, what's wrong with that? We love our children. So many things revolve around them. What's wrong with a child-centered home? Well, the problem is that's not the way that God planned it. That's not the way it works well. The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. What we should have is a Christ-centered home. It's not a child-centered home where everything revolves around whether a little boy or a little girl happy, or 2 or 3. That's not what the home revolves around. It doesn't revolve around whether a father and a mother are happy. It revolves around whether or not we are centered on Jesus Christ. And yet, I think we all know of situations that can exist. We may have seen them in real life. We may have just seen them portrayed on television and movies. But we've seen times when a child is actually, he's right there. He's the hub of the house. Everything revolves around him. Mom and dad cherish him, as they should. But they cherish him to the point where pleasing him is the key. And when that happens, what is likely to happen is that child thinks that's the way of the world. And that child does not know what discipline is. That's suggested by the Proverbs writer here, and we've talked about this before when we talked about discipline. So that's why a child-centered home is a negative thing. A parent-centered home is a negative thing. The Christ-centered home is our goal, because we're going to live in all of those roles according to what the New Testament tells us, what Jesus would have us to be. So, another thing that might provoke, exasperate our child to anger, that they will have to deal with all their lives, could be starting out with a child-centered home. Number 3, sinful anger. Now, I think we're, most of us, familiar with the idea that there's a way to be angry and sin not. I have that scripture up here in just a moment. But there's also a way in which anger can be sinful. The wise man, in fact, said, "Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul." The out of control, angry person is someone to be avoided. And then, of course, the one that I've already mentioned, be angry and do not sin. First part of Ephesians 4:26. When a child sees this as a pattern in the home, the child is likely to grow up with this thought in his mind: anger is the way you solve problems. If that's the way things are done, if they see it from mom and dad toward each other, toward the children, toward him or her, and back and forth, you can be taught many other things in Bible class, but if that is what is modeled, that's what is seen, then the child can grow up. So, you just throw a fit. That's the way you get your way, or at least you end the conversation. Sinful anger that's out of control. And that's another way that we don't want our children to grow up, with that sort of image. All right, let's get one more and then we'll stop for comments. Discipline when angry. And we mentioned this briefly when we talked about discipline, but these are ways that might exasperate a child. Notice what the psalmist says. Notice who is directing this message and who it is directed to. "O Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath, nor chasten me in your hot displeasure." That's the psalmist talking to God. Would you want God angry with you when he decides what he's going to do to you? No. Now, obviously, God is not like a mom or a dad. But the psalmist is using, the kind of figurative speech here, as if God were that. And it's like a little child saying, "Don't spank me, Daddy. Think about it a while. Calm down a little bit. Mommy, let's talk a little bit before you punish me." And of course, children don't generally have the presence of mind to say that, but that's kind of the point there. And we ought to have the presence of mind ourselves as parents that we're not going to do that. That discipline with anger is something that is simply we just don't allow. But parents have stress from all these other places in their lives. They bring it home from the workplace. They sit down to pay the bills. They have aches and pains just like anybody else. All of these stresses, and if not careful, that can be directed toward the child. And whereas here's discipline in a godly way that will instruct and admonish our young person, and here is discipline in an angry way which will simply anger them. And again, teach them a lesson about what to do when you're under pressure. Anger's okay if I'm under pressure. James said, so then, my beloved brethren, every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. I suspect all of us have heard these verses before. And we're simply saying here we want to focus on being slow to wrath. And whatever discipline we have in ourselves, it causes us to say stop and think. And most of us who have ever been parents, and I'm just talking for myself now and people that I've talked to, I suspect most of us would say there have been times in our parenting life, even though it may be over with and gone now for a few years, there have been times when I wish I had calmed down more, when I had thought something through a little bit better, when I had preached some of these points to myself, before I extended discipline to my children. So it's an ever-going challenge there to do that. But don't discipline when we're angry. That can exasperate our children, drive them to anger which can be out of control. Okay, let me pause there now and see what comments, because last week you guys just had so many good comments, and I don't want to stifle discussion if it's there. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Very good. I hope most people could hear that, because there's no way I'll be able to wrap that up in a few sentences, but I'll say a few things. Her point was about the home where the child was coddled, the child was the center of affection, pleasing the child. And she speaks of a study in which people who were like that and now have grown up, the problems they face when they grow up thinking that's the way the world is. And if one comes from a home like that and the other doesn't, in a marriage, for instance, think about the conflict there. Going to work and realizing that your employer is not there to make you happy. The employer is there to make money, produce a good product or a service, and you get some good from that. And all the other things that would not be, that you would not be prepared for if you grew up in a home like that. So good point, Miss Sandy. I appreciate you sharing all that with us. I wish I could repeat it all louder, but yeah, that's the gist of it anyway. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? She reminded me of a story, true story, and I don't know the when and where. It's been too long since I had this particular illustration in front of me. But there was a elementary school, and it was right beside a busy highway. Just zip, 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 zip. It was great big. But the children would only play up within about 10 or 15 feet of the side of the school building. There was this strip, several feet wide, double or more the size of the playground, where they could be playing, but they wouldn't go out there because the traffic was going zip, zip, zip up the road. They just didn't feel safe. And we wouldn't either as adults in some ways. So what the school did, they put up a fence, a rather sturdy fence, all around the playground, right beside that busy road where everybody was flying up and down it. And then what happened? The kids came out and they used all of it because there was a boundary. There was a boundary. Beyond that boundary, there was a safety. Inside that boundary, there was safety. And as Miss Sandy suggested, that's what children want. They want to know what right and wrong is. They may not realize it because they're not mature yet, and they may not ever be if they don't get taught that. But they want to know what's right and what's wrong, what's safe and what's unsafe, what brings blessings and what doesn't. And if parents in Christians' homes don't teach them, there are going to be a lot of places that are going to teach them a bunch of wrong values and mistakes about what's right and wrong. So good point. Neil. One good thing is, as they get older, they're more able to understand something they did wrong yesterday even, and they're being disciplined for it today. So you got something to look forward to there. But with little ones, you're exactly right. We had a family when we lived in Madisonville in church, and he had a bunch of cutest little girls. And he was trying to, something that happened a little bit early, and he had her down face to face explaining to her about why it was wrong. And after he was done, she said, "Daddy, I can see myself in your eyes." So did that talk do any good at all? Yeah. There you go. Jack? Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. 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 We have to train ourselves as much as we train our children, don't we? We have to know ourselves pretty well. You know, why am I doing this? We have to look at our own heart. Am I doing this because it's inconvenienced me, or am I doing this because this is not good for this child and something has to be done about it? Yes. You discipline with love and you punish with what? With anger. Okay, so you're defining those two words that way. Okay. Well, Charlie?
Father is told to bring the child up in the admonition of the Lord. He must of necessity be a student of the word and, of course, practice it.
Absolutely. Yeah, if your goal is to bring that young man or young woman to a point of maturity with a knowing relationship with the Lord, then you're going to have a knowing relationship with the Lord first. Absolutely. Good ideas. Anybody else? Okay, let's go forward. We've got about 6 more minutes, so let's do a couple more and then we'll pause again. Scolding. This is one of the ways that we can exasperate a child. Meaning, basically, we rebuke angrily. Talking about the manner in which we do it. We rebuke angrily. We were dwelling on Ephesians 6:4 there, but it's good to go back to Ephesians 4:9 and what Paul was saying here, and think about our speech in general. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Now, I suspect that Paul had in mind speaking as adults to other adults about spiritual things, for instance, or things that should be done in a spiritual way. But that doesn't mean that this isn't an admonition about how we're to speak to our children as well. Now, the word that is corrupt, it's rotten, it's sick, it's broken, that should not come out of our mouths. That'll help us as we think about what anger is, if we're angrily talking to them. And then, of course, necessary edification for what's good for them. There's certainly a lot of that when we think about our children and what they need to learn, what they need to learn not to do at times. So to edify them, to make them stronger, we definitely would want to avoid the practice of scolding. Scolding or rebuking angrily is not consistent with the passage that talks about training, admonishing, instructing, even reprove and rebuke. There's no angrily in there as an adverb. We do those things with love and for this purpose, necessary edification, whether it's a brother, sister in Christ, someone who's not a Christian, or our children. All right, another one. Inconsistent discipline. I can't remember if we already got to this a little bit or not. No, I don't think we have tonight at least. Inconsistent discipline. Paul says, therefore, when I was planning this, did I do it lightly? Or the things I plan, do I plan according to the flesh? That with me there should be yes, yes, and no, no. But as God is faithful, our word to you is not yes and no. He's talking to the Corinthians, and he's especially, we think, addressing that minority group that was opposing him. All the people that were, in some cases thinking they were super apostles and they were as smart as Paul, or maybe smarter. And they just caused all kinds of trouble for Paul there at Corinth and opposing him. And what he says is, Think about when I came there, and this is for his opponents and for the rest of the membership to think about. When I came to you, did I say yes one way and no the next? Did I change my story? Have I been consistent? The answer is yes. Paul was consistent. He always taught them the gospel in its truth and simplicity. So he wasn't a yes man today and a no man tomorrow. There was consistency there. Now, what does this have to do with discipline? Well, there's a couple of ways. It could be the case in which mom and dad don't agree on discipline. Would that exasperate a child? You know, if dad thinks these things are wrong and mom doesn't, or mom thinks you just can't do these things, and dad said, I don't want to hurt anything. And a child has to live with that. Now, we all know that mom and dad may not be in total agreement on everything, but if we let that inconsistency and agreement come through to our child and we behave that way, we punish them for something one day, and then the next day the other parent's not around, they don't get punished for it. Pretty soon, what's going to happen to that child? They're still not going to get a rightful representation of what's right and what's wrong. So that's one way that inconsistent discipline can be very exasperating. But there's also another way, and that's when mom and dad maybe agree, but they don't do the same thing every day. You know, one time, this same action is punishable by something significant, and then another time they just let it go. That would be inconsistent discipline as well. And it leaves the child thinking, well, where are the boundaries? As Miss Sandy was talking about a while ago. Where are the boundaries? What can I do and not do? How would you like to be on edge thinking, I wonder how they're going to take this today, this mistake that I've just made? Is it going to be ignored because they've got, you know, the mortgage and car payment and all these other things on their mind? Or are they going to notice it? And I'm going to be disciplined in some way. Which is it going to be? And that's another way that a child can be brought to an exasperated type of anger. I think we're about out of time. We've got about 1 minute, so I'm going to stop there and see any more closing comments, observations. And we've got much more of these for next week. So I appreciate the good conversation, or good comments. I want to keep that going each week. And we hope to cover a lot more good things too. Comments? And we don't want to sit and look at each other. There we go. Good. I thought we were going to sit and look at each other for a minute, and that would have been awkward.